The Sleeches are an enemy that were introduced in Oddworld Soulstorm, so needless to say, spoilers for that game. Sleeches are deadly creatures found in great numbers in the dark depths of the sanctum of the Mudokon burial ground Necrum, where they guard the stone of the Fragon's eye that Abe is sent to collect by the Keeper. A series of flintlock trials involving Sleeches designed to teach the value of light is what awaits Abe in this process. As a result, this seems to suggest that the Sleeches potentially have some kind of close connection to the Mudokons in the same vein as paramites or scraps, which potentially could be why their guano, their droppings, are known to have medicinal qualities for Mudokons. What's interesting about the Sleeches is that not a lot is known about them, and I wonder why that is exactly. Obviously they're brand new creatures, so naturally not much would be known about them, but it almost seems to me like there's purposefully little information about them out there. From what I remember from reading the Oddworld Soulstorm Art of the Video Game book, I don't even think they were mentioned once in that, which really surprised me. I thought they might get a page or something, but there was nothing. But the reason I was surprised by this is because in Soulstorm, Sleeches are very hard to see clearly. They just sort of appear as dark little blobs with slimy tentacles and glowing red eyes on the screen, and that's pretty much all you can distinguish about them, especially because they are constantly moving, bouncing around at quite high speeds. But in reality, Oddworld Inhabitants and the team behind Soulstorm actually puts a lot of detail into the Sleech's design, as you'd perhaps expect from Oddworld. As opposed to simple round blobs, they actually have quite a distinctive shape that's almost reminiscent of a frog's head, with their two eyes actually poking up. They have really lumpy skin, with tons of various sized bumps all over, and they have this rather horror-esque mouth, split in 5 directions, well concealed by 5 or so flaps I mean. Even their eyes, that of course are just red and glowy, in reality are detailed to an arguably almost pointless degree, considering their light up glowing nature that obscures any fine details, and of course the fact that they appear so tiny because you only see them so far away from the screen. They actually put so much detail into the texture of the eyes that you can even make out the shape of a pupil on them, although it's hard to see because they're coloured the same as the rest of the eye. I'm thinking maybe they did this because they were considering having a different coloured pupil or something like that. So actually they really did an amazing job and took great care when designing the Sleeches, as well as other aspects of the game that you don't really see that well within the gameplay. Speaking of which, you want to know what Sleech turds look like in full detail? Here you go. Sleech guano in full quality that you just don't get to experience in game. It's as a result of how much detail they put into their design, details that aren't really realistically visible in the game, that it surprises me that they didn't show this all off with a page in the Soulstorm art book. I'm talking about the design of the Sleech, not the guano. I thought they'd probably release a fully rendered up-close image of a Sleech, as they put so much effort into the design that it would have been really interesting to read about the process of how they were created and putting them into the game. Of particular note is the colour of the Sleeches themselves, which is something that's interesting because it's quite unusual and seems to have this sort of weird quality to it. It's been described as being a grey colour, but they actually seem to be very luminescent creatures of some kind and reflect the light that's around them. Their natural habitat is pitch black, incredibly dark, and as a result they themselves almost always appear very dark too. But actually, looking at the model of the Sleech, as I've shown it so far in this video, like this, that is not actually how they originally looked. Originally, when I first found them and loaded them up, they looked like this, basically white, to the point I initially didn't recognise them as being Sleeches. I was like, what the hell is this thing? But then when I changed the albedo setting, they became darker and much more recognisable, and I realised, oh, it's a Sleech. The albedo setting, which to be honest I didn't even know what the devil that actually is until finally bothering to look into it briefly a few minutes ago, basically, from what I can gather anyway, controls the overall brightness of an object and or the reflective quality of a material. So in reality, it seems the Sleeches reflect their surroundings. I think they're naturally white, or this kind of white colour anyway, but appear black due to almost always being in the dark. As a result, when more natural lighting shines on them, their whiteness comes out a bit more, giving them a grey appearance. Likewise, they appear very luminescent red when near flares, and they garner a blue tint when you shine your hand torch on them. But of course they avoid this at all cost. Sleeches are extremely vulnerable to light and can easily be warded off by it. They must be really sensitive to it, considering the fact that Necrum itself is already an incredibly dark place. And yet they reside in the lowest depths of Necrum at its darkest. Then maybe that's just due to industrialist intervention above. This is in contrast somewhat to their younger selves. It's quite well known, of course, that Sleeches are the adult form of Fleeches. Creatures that, although prefer dark habitats, have been seen to be completely fine existing in daylight and bright areas, like the Necrum jungle. So it's interesting that they seemingly develop with such a great weakness when they get older. The relationship between Fleeches and Sleeches has been compared to the real world, I should have looked up how to pronounce this before I started recording, the real world Swedish paradoxa, also known as the paradoxical frog or the shrinking frog. Whereas most frogs start life as tiny tadpoles and are metamorphosized into frogs, the paradoxical frog's tadpole is massive in comparison to its smaller adult frog form. So likewise, from what I gather, the larvae Fleech state, which seems to be relatively large in comparison, hatches into the Sleech, which seems to be quite a bit smaller. Although they seem much different from each other at first glance, a nice detail about the Sleeches is that, much like the Fleeches, they do actually attack Abe with their tongues in a very similar manner to them. If you look closely, you can see their tongues whipping out to strike Abe in pretty much exactly the same fashion. Now this might be an obvious detail, but personally it's something I just didn't even notice the first time around when playing it. It was only when I played the level again that I saw the silhouette of their tongues poke out, and I was just like, oh well, that's just like the Fleeches. So it seems that much like the Fleeches, Sleeches have razor sharp tongues with which they use to kill, although unlike the Fleeches, they don't seem to be sticky and use them in that same manner, like using their tongues to drag their prey into their mouths. Instead, by the looks of it from the gameplay, they just seem to use these long flexible tongues to strike out, with a very large and very visible sharp point on the end of them, and stab their prey to death. They then appear to perhaps eat the prey by continuing to strike the dead carcass, perhaps grabbing pieces of flesh on their tongues like a fork and dragging them into their mouths. Or at least that's what it looks like to me anyway. I guess unlike the instantly digesting Fleeches, the Sleeches get full easily, or are on a diet and perhaps prefer smaller portions. Of course, in reality, I assume it's just the way the game was made. They're designed to strike at Abe, and when Abe dies, they just simply continue to do that. I'm just coming up with theories to justify why in universe that happens, just for the fun of it basically. Interestingly, I was just playing it again yesterday and noticed yet another thing that I didn't before, that some of the Sleeches have like an orange light on them as they were bobbing up and down. And from what I can gather, I think this is the Sleech's tongue. If you slow down footage of them attacking, these orange lines strike out at Abe. The thing is some of them don't have this, and their tongues appear black when striking out as you'd expect, so that's kind of weird, that only the occasional Sleech has a glowing bright orange tongue that can be seen. I guess for its body maybe, it looks like, because you can even see it when it's not attacking, so I don't know, maybe they're just constantly poking their tongues out. Well, these orange lights have like a red circle on the end of them at times, so I wonder if this is like a mistake, like in game development where you can like turn on a thing where it gives a visual representation of something. For example, an enemy's line of sight or hitboxes and that kind of thing. Maybe this is what that is, perhaps it's a glitch where we're able to see the out of game indication of what the tongues are doing and what they're hitting and that kind of thing, if that makes sense. And the red circle is like their attack box, like if they hit Abe it counts as an attack and that kind of thing. I could be completely wrong, it's just a really weird aspect about them. Now, one thing that I thought of that was quite interesting is that the Sleeches being able to be easily deterred by light, having such a glaring weakness, if you'll pardon the pun, means that they're really only dangerous in great quantities, in contrast to Fleeches, where a single Fleech is very deadly. The Sleeches attack in massive numbers and surround their prey, because you have to keep looking at them, shining light on them, kind of like the Weeping Angels. And if there's too many, you simply can't keep an eye on every single one all the time and they'll kill you. Now, the great numbers of the Sleeches is contrasted by the Fleeches, I'd say. Fleeches are sometimes seen in great quantities, but frequently not that many. Often there's only a couple Fleeches together or so. Now of course, Fleeches don't need to be in as many numbers as Sleeches do, but at the same time, it's just interesting that in terms of population count, what we've seen of both doesn't match exactly. Which of course there could be 100 different reasons for, and it's not even remotely a discrepancy, but the reason I'm bringing it up is because it made me realise something. Fleeches have 2 heads and 2 tongues. Sleeches have 1 head and 1 tongue. So maybe when a Fleech hatches, 2 Sleeches come out instead of just 1. Which would explain why, from what we've seen of both races, there seems to be so many more Sleeches together. And plus it would also explain the size difference between the 2 species, with Sleeches seemingly being about half the size of Fleeches, despite being their adult forms, because there'd be 2 Sleeches within 1 Fleech. It kinda makes sense. I could be wrong of course, but it's just something that I thought was really interesting to consider. The Sleeches was something that a lot of thought was put into, as apparently Lorne Lanning was obsessed with their design, and they were inspired by his experience of having had a couple of homes throughout his life that had problems with rats, as well as hearing stories from a friend of his who dealt with cockroach infestations. Lorne thought this would be very cool to put in a game, and as a result the Sleeches were created with this idea in mind, that they would attack the player en masse. Inspired by the way cockroaches will scatter and hide when you turn the light on, the Sleeches also have this same fear of light, as Oddworld Inhabitants wanted to take full advantage of the dynamic lighting in Oddworld Soulstorm and utilise it as a weapon. This was designed in contrast to the immediate chase gameplay as typically experienced with the Fleeches, and instead this forces the player to slow down and carefully navigate your surroundings. Which makes sense in the trap-infested Necrum Sanctum, where you have to watch your step. As a result, it's actually quite a clever gameplay element to force the player to slow down here, and force them to be very careful about choosing when the right time is to run, while attempting to keep back the masses of Sleeches. Meanwhile, the player experiences the strange and disturbing screeches made by the Sleeches, as well as the disgusting noise that's generated by the sliminess of their movement, enhancing the whole experience and the atmosphere of the Sanctum. The Sleech's newness to the franchise is another aspect about them that makes them quite fascinating, as they're a unique part of Soulstorm. I think it's fair to say they're the only new creatures introduced in the game, discounting all the many Slig variants, and they're pretty much the first new Oddworld creature introduced since Stranger's Wrath, potentially, but I'm probably forgetting about a million things. As a result, I find it quite a shame that they're only present in 1 level in the entire game. It would have been really nice to have had a couple featuring the Sleeches, and it seems odd to me that they develop a creature only for it to appear in 1 level in the entire game. I previously made a video theorising on the possibility that potentially Fleeches were meant to be in the funicular level, due to the Mudokon in that level claiming that Fleeches were in the cave as well as their guano, but instead Slugs and Sleech guano was in there instead. But here's another theory to consider. Potentially Fleeches as we know them from Abe's Exoddus were never meant to be in Oddworld Soulstorm at all, and instead it was the Sleeches that were meant to be in the cave all along, except at the time they were potentially going to be called Fleeches. I say this because in the files of Soulstorm, the Sleeches are not called Sleeches, they're called Fleeches, and during the development of the game they were referred to as Fleeches as well. Now maybe this was just their working title that they simply used when making it, but potentially as they are the adult forms of Fleeches, they themselves were simply going to be called Fleeches too. You don't change your name when you reach a certain age after all, which would explain why the Mudokon refers to them as Fleeches and that was left in, as simply a relic title. All this is purely just me speculating, I don't know of course, I could be entirely wrong. As for why the Sleeches weren't actually in the caves themselves, perhaps they just simply couldn't work them into the caves effectively. Sometimes an enemy just doesn't fit with the gameplay and level conditions and you just do a workaround, I'd imagine. If you've got Slugs and they'd fit better in the caves gameplay wise, then it makes sense to put them in there instead. And plus it keeps the Sleeches as a surprise and something fresh later on when you do encounter them midway through the game. I could be wrong about all this of course, it's just something I felt was worth pointing out I guess. As a result, I would say we really haven't seen much of the Sleeches so far, or their full potential as great threats to Abe. Consequently, I'd certainly love to see Oddworld Inhabitants take advantage of the Sleeches they've made for the gameplay, and maybe use them in a DLC if they perhaps make one, which I've heard they're working on something, but I don't know if it's a DLC or what. But it would be really nice to learn more about this new enemy that we don't really know that much about yet, and encounter them in new Oddworld games and media, making further use of the Sleeches.
Hello, follow me. Yo.